now that you saw the pain that it takes to get mono running on IBMI and all the work that Calvin went through, um, we'll learn a little bit about how to practically apply some of that stuff. So, all right. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Director of Document Management here at Health Systems. Owned RJS Software for 24 years, and I have kind of a storied background on integration. Actually, starting in Rochester, ironically, I used to work for a company called Telex back in the 80s, and so my first exposure to integration was on the System 36, trying to bring a 5250 screen together with an AS400 or a PC application value, and so that was my introduction to Halapi and VB3, C++. When TCP came out, I've done FTP and sockets programming and web development and client access and JT400 and just about any plug that's come out, including all the stuff that Kevin's and Jesse's team has been working on. So it's been quite an interesting era because I started right pre-PC when the old ATXTs were out to where we're at today with mobile development. So definitely come a long way since those days. My interest in .NET goes back to, so I started with Windows apps in 93 and 94. The first app I wrote was a Windows app for downloading spool files of all things from the I, and it was Visual C. When .NET came out, we had written some report delivery products in VB back then, and we had literally maxed out the code base. Like, you couldn't put any more code in. We had jammed so much code inside of those. So .NET was kind of a godsend for us at that point. And then, I've done a lot of integration with .NET to I. And back in 05, with our WebDocs product, I took JT400 and ran it through a converter called IKVM, and we used that for several years as an interface to IBMI. So we're actually using JT400 from .NET, which is pretty cool stuff. And historically, Windows apps were disliked by IBMI people, right? I know I do roadmaps here, and we talk to customers sometimes where they say, I want to keep everything on I and this and that. So I started searching for ways to run .NET and IBMI back in 05. About that same time frame, I started working with the IKVM stuff. So it was more of a desire than a must-have, especially today, because we have VMware images. I can't count the times I told customers, spin up a VM, and you can run that right beside your IBMI without an issue. And I don't know of a shop today that doesn't have some sort of VMware footprint internally or in their data center in general. So I learned about Bill Sawyer's. We were talking about that a little earlier. I learned about his intern experiment. They did a couple months and had 4 interns working on it. And I think, as Jesse said, some stuff worked, some stuff didn't. And so really, and I reached out to ask for access to the source code at one point, and he just said he couldn't release it. And so I kind of wrote that off as, we're dead in the water. This will never happen, right? So come 2018, which I learned of Calvin's monoport. I think I learned about it from Mark Waterbury before Calvin had his article in Mid-Range Press or IT Jungle. And then Calvin reached out to me through email, said, hey, I'd like to hear about what you're doing with .NET stuff. And so I thought, well, I'm going to load this up and give it a try and see what happens. So I was kind of doubtful, it was going to work. But I was pleasantly surprised when I started playing around and actually bringing pieces of code that I had running elsewhere and dropping them into the I. In fact, I hadn't even visualized I could just drop a Visual Studio compiled executable into the IFS and just run it until I was asking Calvin questions. He's like, well, you just compile it in Visual Studio. You don't need a command line. And so I tried it, and I was like, wow, this is cool, easy. So part of what I'm doing is, and you'll see, I'll share some links, but I plan to continue to build out sample use cases that you can take and build stuff off of. I know you talked about reporting things, and I'll talk about some other use cases today as well that I think are handy. I even did a sample integration to one of our we have a product called WebDocs for Windows. We have an I version as well, but I wrote a CL command that actually integrates through its web service using the mono wrapper stuff. So I was able to take some C# I already had and just repurpose it and run it on the I. So I'll show you how that works too, and how you can wrap around the mono stuff. So it's not all QP term and running through a Q shell terminal to do this stuff, especially if you're IBMI. And so, I think I told Calvin this, but I'm hoping right now he's sort of the guy for this mono project, so I'm hoping he stays involved and has an interest. I know he's excited, and that's why I wanted to really underscore the importance of what he was doing. And when I talked about giving this presentation to Chuck back in November, I said, I'd really like to bring Calvin in because he did all the work. I'm just being able to use the product of what he put together. So, and obviously Jesse and team, I think, is somewhat invested in this too. So hopefully we'll keep that train moving forward and continue doing more and more with .NET along with all the other stacks. I think there's not really anything missing in today's world, right? We talked about Golang, but we have Ruby, Python, .NET, PHP, just about everything. Java has been there a long time as well. Yeah, there are more things, of course. Golang, right? We talked about, and yeah, and you guys know all the tools. um, so this is interesting. So we were talking yesterday about, I thought a little history on mono, just for those of you that haven't heard of it. But I was asking Calvin, I said, how do you pronounce mono? Because you kind of say mono, I say mono, and he said, well, let me just reach out to Miguel and I'll ask him. So he's already connected into Miguel, who was the architect of this stuff. So he's got a direct pipeline to him. So kudos to you, because that's a great way to learn about this stuff, right? Yeah, mano is what he always said you pronounce it. So Spanish for monkey, I learned that too when I was looking at that. I guess I never realized from looking at the icon, right? You know, you can see. But so it started out as a cross-platform open source .NET framework, originally developed by Zimian, which was started by Miguel and a couple others, I believe, to do. I think they wrote like the GNOME desktop and some of those things for Linux early on. So he architected a lot of that. They sold to Novell in 2003. So, you know, mergers and acquisitions have been going on forever. Novell was acquired by Attachmate in 2011, believe it or not, and Attachmate laid off all the staff. So they were briefly owned by an IBMI company, ironically, right, Attachmate. So Miguel and his friend founded Xamarin, which provided tools for building mobile apps, since mobile became so big for iOS and Android, and using C#. And then they were subsequently, I knew it would happen eventually, and they were acquired in 2016. And so that team still develops a lot of the .NET technologies like Visual Studio for Mac, which came from Mono Develop, and some of the other stacks for the mobile devices as well. So definitely interesting. When I talked to Jordan about that, he said, do they still develop Mono? So it is still being developed, so, and it's kept current. It's up to, it may be newer. I did this about a month or two ago, but .NET 4.72, which is almost the most current framework version, and then it's Mono version 5.18, which is current as of December, so I think relatively current. And then we already talked about the Xamarin Studio and Visual Studio for Mac were sort of offshoots of that. So current technology using current .NET, which is cool. I like that. So my session now is going to talk about, so we'll do, and I'm not actually going to go through the setup, but part of what I want you guys to have as a takeaway is how to set up this environment on I. So I'll talk through that a little bit in the components. We'll talk about several use cases. We'll talk about some wrappers that I built, and I'll show you some examples of using that and utilizing it, and then a few practical C# examples too. And all this stuff is freely available out on GitHub. So cool thing is you can play with it. Not an in-depth C# or a VB class. I did have to get VB in there because I was always a VB guy up until I finally retrained my brain in the last 12 months. But you can actually do VB now and run an IBI as well. So that's pretty cool. We might do a future session on C# development if there's interest. I don't know, but you know, that might be use case building. So just to kind of cover where can I use this, right? Because if you're thinking you can run Microsoft Word in a shell session or something like that, no, not today. Although Calvin says it could potentially be done at some point. But the reality is that, so .NET console application is, I liken it to a CL program, right? And so I've actually used a lot of these techniques even with Python and PHP, where you can call those programs and then pipe the output back, which is called standard out. So the idea is that typically you might pass a set of parameters into a .NET program that's a console app. It's going to do some work. I call it top down, just like CL, because you're flowing through the program usually, maybe calling a bunch of stuff, and then out the backside comes success or failure or any feedback information that you want to send. And again, those can be written in C# or VB. And so a lot of the stuff I'm writing, I tend to write utility sort of stuff, is a lot of those type of apps. And then secondarily, you have services, right? So as Calvin was talking about, there's a framework. We were talking about web forms yesterday, and I said, because one of the issues with web forms is it requires what they call the GDI plus currently. Yeah, it's like the graphics rendering stuff. And in reality, how many people are developing web forms today anyways, right? Probably JavaScript-based applications and that. But there's a framework called Nancy, which I've used a lot, and it works on I. I didn't get a chance to get the sample in yet to this mix, but you can actually create web server applications, like your own content management system or some sort of application layer that's web-based if you want. And then same thing with services as well. So if you wanted to build web services that send back XML and JSON and that sort of stuff too. So those are typically maybe submitted to the background. They might run as a batch job when you kick it off or something like that. But those are typically, you know, like we used to say, we used to call them NEPs, or never-ending programs, right? Sits in the background, runs as a batch job. It might be like an email sender, might be a directory watcher, might be monitoring data queues. And then, you know, typically they might be logging to a file or maybe out to an IFS file or something similar or that. So in terms of scope, so take the GUI piece out of it from a graphical. Just about every other type of application that you might want to run, you can build in that in terms of .NET, which I think is cool. And there's a lot of things you can do. So things that won't work, we talked about GUI, Win32 APIs, so any of the Windows-based APIs, unless smarter people than me decide to port some of that stuff. IKVM, I think you said you tested it, right? Just barely. Yeah, and so I tried using because I had a couple suggestions. Try using your JT400 DLL there, but I think there's something with IKVM that doesn't work yet. Yeah, so we'll look at that as a layer to be able to use JT400. NetBIOS file shares require Kerberos, although one of the things I was actually one of the first people that asked for Samba in the eye, but I was one of the people that probably never used it. But I discovered, as I was playing around with this, the Samba zip file, and even if you're not running the Samba server, you can actually use the SMB client or the Samba client in conjunction with these calls. Because under the covers, if you call something from one of these .NET apps, it can call paste command line. So DB2 CLI or Samba in this case. So I'm actually building a CL wrapper around that too, so you can send and receive files back and forth across the network using the SMB client, but you don't have to mess with net server and some of the other environment. And then you can call those out of a .NET app as well. So kind of a middle thing until we figure out Kerberos. The ODBC and ADO.NET drivers, I'll talk about that at the end. Tried a few of those. There's a few glitches here and there yet. XML service, I built a wrapper on that. And then the DB2 CLI stuff, I actually built a wrapper around the CLI. So it actually takes the data. So when you use CLI, and you'll see this in my example, it actually gives you all the data back in that stream. And then it gives you dashes at the top that mark the field link. So I kind of cheated on that one, but it works pretty well. Not my ideal way of doing database access, but we'll talk about, as I said towards the end, there's a couple other options that are still experimental as I look at it currently. When I was testing, I was doing a mono mail sending application, and Calvin clued me into that certificates don't just load themselves either, right? So I've come up with some advice. I have to actually add it to the final version of these slides, but there's some things you need to do to preload certs so that you can actually use SSL. So my example will actually send an email out through Office 365, but it could be Gmail, it could be an unsecure SMTP server or something like that. But web services work kind of the same way. You can actually call out to web services and download files and upload and that sort of stuff too. So both posting and getting web service stuff. So really most anything that's natively written in C# or VB and doesn't have an external dependency on other DLLs unless they're C# will run natively. I thought that was pretty cool. So I was excited when I started playing around with this in November. And then I got sick for a week and a half when I was in Florida. So I didn't work on any of this stuff while I was sick. I don't know if anybody else got that nasty cold this year, but so I was down for almost till mid-December and then started working on this more and more. And then we started working on trying to get Calvin to come up here. So that took us a few months. So the Samba client, we talked about that already. So a couple of things that you can use with that once I release the wrapper for that. You can send and receive. You'll be able to verify files. So it'll actually send a file and read back and verify that the contents actually made it to the other end too. So that's kind of a nice thing because I used a similar technique in conjunction with our WebDoc software before. You can list directories on remote servers, create directories, remove directories. So a lot of that file management that you can do for Windows files now you can do without setting up NFS or without using NetServer, which I've always found pretty painful, trying to go out to a Windows share. If you don't get the security permissions just right, it doesn't always work. So anyways, that'll be something new. There's one issue I found. I wasn't sure where to put this. I thought I'd put it up front. Calvin and I talked about this. There's issues with dealing with UTC time offsets and things like that. So one of the things I tell people, and my examples have this, is this one line right now I set at the top of every one of my programs to make sure that it sets the right time zone. If you don't do that, everything UTC offset 0, and it doesn't pick up an IBMI system value. If you set it in PACE or even in the regular OS 400 job, it actually converts the numeric format. I don't know if you guys knew that too, but I don't get America/New York. It actually converts it to a weird time format that Mono doesn't like. So at least for right now, this is how I recommend you'd set your time zone. Maybe you have a setting in your application or something like that. But that'll make sure you get dates and times and that sort of stuff correct. Is that, you mean if you don't? Yeah, I kind of said Yeah, so part of it, and I actually did a sample app here that will list time zones too, because I figured people in different time zones that use this might want to know the spelling for their time. So if every one of these is interesting, there's probably about 300 or 400 of those. So the cool thing is you can list those out easy. I'll show you the sample for that. I figured that was important. So the three core components that we have is obviously the mono binary distribution. As you saw, a lot of work went into this by Calvin, and I can't underscore enough the work that one guy did on this, right? And obviously he's asked people and had input, and he's part of the team for mono, and I think that's pretty cool. So obviously that's a requirement. So we'll talk through how you load that. And then the library I wrote, which is a mono wrapper, not a requirement, but I think it'll make your life a lot easier. And then I have a library of C# samples that anybody else can contribute to as well, that I built sort of as a starting point, right? If somebody hasn't used this stuff, here's some stuff we know works and isn't going to break. And it's pretty well documented, so that's good. So I think this was on Calvin's site. I think in terms of PTFs, before you load it, I loaded on a V7R3 box right away. I didn't have any issues. I didn't even look at my. Well, yeah, and I think the save file is fine. It's just more, I didn't look at the pre-required PTFs. I'm not sure where you got this requirement, but those technically are the requirements that was listed on your site, right? Yep, and as you said, we now recommend you can use Git and wget and install those via Yum, right? So we have those packages available. So if you haven't installed any of the 5733 OPS stuff, you probably would use Yum packages. Is that fair to say, Jesse, nowadays? Yep, Jesse says use the Yum packages. For those of you out there in webinar land. I'm working on the RPMs. Yep, well, yeah, and they're showing, and the RPMs are already showing up in Ivan's external repository. Yeah, and make sure you put VB in there, because I found that was missing in the Yum repository. Exactly. Yep, so you want to do that, and this is just a couple screenshots of, if you do install the open source package management, use IBM ACS, and then just make sure you pick Git and wget as your bare minimums. I don't know if there's any other requirements for wget, but I think those are the two pieces that we're using. All right, so I gave, and I found this interesting because as I was experimenting, I've always used the FTP upload method of save files and restore and that sort of stuff. But I came up using wget. There's a couple variations you could do. In fact, one of them takes it right into a save file with wget. If you guys tried that at all, but you can actually download directly into the save file from wget, which is neat. So in this case, this is an example of created a save file, and you can go through the same list of instructions. And then in this case, upload the save file through FTP or whatever into that save file if you have it, and then run this restore statement, and that restores the entire mono path. So, and then there's a couple, you want to make sure there's a short link to /opt. I think that was on your instruction site. Oh, yeah, but it's worked for me. I've done it a couple times on clean partner world machines, and seems to work. So that's cool. Yeah. Yeah, RPM is good, right? And then the option, so if you use wget, the cool thing here is you still create your save file, but you can just do, if you this is the link to Calvin's save file, and I recommend right now using the 10.13.18 version until, because I found some issues with the 119, which we're not sure about yet, but this version works great, and this places it right into this save file in QGPL, and we tell it not to check the certificate, and then all we have to do is run a restore. So the cool thing is you can download save files now right into a save file and then just run restore. Or if that for whatever reason doesn't work for you, I don't know if it works on older releases. I tried it on 7.3. You can just go ahead and download it to an IFS location. Like in this case, I downloaded it to /temp, and then I do a copy from stream file, and then the last step is the restore. So roughly the same thing. But if you're packaging or downloading other stuff that's not related to this, any of these three techniques can be used for what you're doing, which I thought was kind of cool. So, and noteworthy. Then when you're done, you do a work link on /opt/mono. It should look like that, right? So you should have all those directories sitting out in your IFS. And then now, this is where we actually look at Calvin's sample, right? let's pull out of this for a second. I'm doing mine. I actually compromise. I don't do green screen. I do I call it turquoise screen. So let's see. And I'm a little lazy when I do these, so I copy paste. So this is the sample Calvin was going to show you on building that first example. So first thing we'll do. Oh, I guess I got to go into paste. So this basically sets the directory, and we. Like a library list. Yep, exactly. You start throwing that into your library list, and then cd opt mono samples, right? So there's one sample C# in there, I believe, for your initial one. Yep, and you can see it's already been compiled. So it's just MCS, right? And so we were talking about native compiling. So that just compiled that executable. And then just to run it, I can just say mono. And it's a pretty simple program, but we got our hello information. So we know it works. And that when I saw that work, I was like, wow, this is cool. I got to put some stuff on here and try it. So in this case, I don't know that we need, so that's an example for that hello world, and probably a good test when you install it in your box too. Just run that to make sure it works. And this just shows, that was my screenshots on that. So why would I want IBM wrapper commands, right? So we know mono is working now, so yeah, that's great. So why would I want to wrap this with a set of CL commands? So integrating to traditional CL or RPG or COBOL with .NET. So and actually this same wrapper concept applies to Python or Ruby or PHP, because I've done it, right, the same wrapper on every one of those guys. But it can help make a traditional IBM programmer more comfortable using .NET from their applications, right? So that's an idea. Or if you didn't want to do that, you could call .NET from the paste terminal, but just remove that from the mix because we do it automatically. Returns output. So think of job log information or parameters. Not exactly the same mechanically how it works, but I can throw information out into the, so we log in the mono wrapper commands, as you see. It'll log to the IFS, logs to an out file, so you can actually consume that. It puts it in the job log optionally. Don't do that if you're listing thousands and thousands of files, because I blew up the job log doing that. And then you can also go into spool files, right? So if you wanted to print a job log for whatever reason. So it keeps it high level. And one of the things I've always been about is promoting that our IBMI and our .NET and our multi-platform teams work together. So that's not always the case. I know, because I get into political discussions on some of the lists where people say that's just the way our team wants it. But I've always been about promoting that team sharing. And interestingly enough, I don't think I have it in here at all, but Nils Lisberg, if I pronounce that correctly, he's got a product called Icebreak, and he was telling me that the naming from that came from, he wrote that as a icebreaker between RPG and .NET teams. So I didn't know that until he shared that with me. And so he's open sourced a lot of that technology now too. So obviously it's something it's still there, like any cultural difference, but hopefully this helps us bridge the chasm on that a little bit if you had different teams. The mono wrapper commands. So again, I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on that. Same thing, I can upload with FTP. I can use wget to pull those down, and then I can also do the download and then copy from stream file if I want to as well. And so then after it's downloaded, source only, because I tend to try and put just source if it goes on GitHub rather than compiled objects. So there's a CL program that you can make, and then a build. It takes like not even a minute, usually on most systems. But that'll build the mono CL command and really all the binaries that you need to front end on the mono side. Mono. And then it'll look like this. You'll have all your objects in the mono I library. Thought it was appropriate to suffix with I. So the commands that are sort of contained in there. So there's one called mono, and as any good programmer does, I wrestle with myself. So I created a mono 2 version because mono passes parameters in you can do 40, I think it's 40 parameters of 400 bytes each, but it uses the standard old style CL command list, right? So some people like to just pass the command string like they would in paste. So mono 2 has a nice big long command line where you can put double quotes around each one of your parameters. So more of a style thing, but since I was wrestling with myself and I wrote it both ways, I thought we'd include mono and mono 2. And then there's a mono path command. Since I'm not sure best ways to set paths, and I know you can have set up default paths. I don't know if there's a per user, or I think you can do it in system values too. But for the .NET stuff, I ended up building a CL command that sets the mono path, sets the package path to all the yum stuff if it happens to be out there. But so for right now, I kind of recommend using that. And I chose not to put it inside the mono command. I had it in there, and I took it out, and I thought, well, let the user set that up. And then I was experimenting with DB2 Connect. So I came up with this mono DB2 path, which also was putting some of the DB2 Connect stuff in there. So I actually got that driver to work, but there were some hacks. And in fact, Calvin helped me with a few of those to actually get it to ignore some of the AIX binaries that it was trying to reference, and got it to work. But there's still some issues like we ran into just in general with those database access things. There's an IFS file checker if you want to use it. There's a temp directory, so I created a temp mono directory for any of the log files that we create to try and keep them in one place. I created a CL command wrapper on front of mono on this xbuild command because I could never remember this. So I thought you could just do mono xbuild, specify a path, and build your program. And then on top of the run SQL command, which is in the newer releases, I found there were certain cases where I didn't want to, because of some of the database deficiencies, I thought I'd build kind of a convenience command that runs on top of the run SQL command so I can create temp tables, right? So I can just call this CL command from a C# app and have it run a query and build a temp table for me. So there's probably better ways to do that once we figure out more of the database stuff, but I thought it was a nice convenience wrapper around run SQL, so it's something you can play with. Creates an out file, and then or you can put it in. I created a mono temp library, kind of like Qtemp, but it's a system-wide one. Or you can put it in there, or run it in your Qtemp lib, or wherever you want. Actually, I don't think it would work in Qtemp, would it, with Paste Job, because you're crossing boundaries. All right, so yeah, so we said the mono temp file locations /temp/mono temp library, and I just recommend that with periodically, if you run this stuff, jobs fail sometimes and may not always clean up. So I created that mono temp clear command, so you can clear that periodically if you want. Maybe every time you IPL, that clears up all your temp files. And then same thing with a clear lib on mono temp, because nothing permanent should go into that library if you decide to use that as your naming convention for any temporary objects that you create. So the parameters, so the mono command looks like this. So the idea is, so you saw we did our call, our mono, and then space, and then the program. What this guy does is front ends all those calls to the actual program. So I decided that rather than specifying the whole path and the executable as one, I've decided I'd separate it. So you give it the work directory where that executable is stored, and then the exe name, and then it builds that as a path before it runs it. This is my arbitrary choice. This is an example that's using the individual parameters, so they get passed. This would be a list if I were to do F4 on it. The path to mono as well, so I'm passing that along. So once we have the yum packages out, I'm hoping that we'll probably data area that or something, so it finds the yum packages, or maybe just look for it in the search path. But you know, again, this is new stuff, fluid. It'll change in 2 months probably or less. And then we have our logging information. So display standard out, which is our login info, log, print, delete. And so, okay, we already talked about all that. Yep, the work directory, the executable file can be compiled in Paste, can be compiled in Visual Studio and just copied. You also need to copy any external DLL. So if you build this over on Visual Studio, and let's say I'm using JSON, there's a JSON.NET DLL. All of those runtime DLLs have to get copied with your executable. The idea is that whole app can live in one directory, almost like a library, right? If you had all your objects in a library, you have to copy all those over. I found out when I used xbuild the other day that the NuGet poll doesn't work, and I think Calvin said it's not working yet, right? Yeah, so I tend to use a lot of NuGet packages, as probably a lot of us do. So in this case, it won't pull those. So I just decided in my world, I'm using Visual Studio, and I just blast up the executable every time it's Oh, that's true. You could, except NuGet will still get me though on that one, right? Yeah. So Kevin just said you could build from Paste and run on Windows because it's an ambidextrous executable, right? Yeah. So once you get NuGet working, then I might consider using xbuild more. Or if you do an app that doesn't require an external package like that, but NuGet, like the Paste library I created, I'll probably put that as a NuGet package so you can just pull it in anytime you want to use it and not have to have the source every time. Those are real handy. So arguments, we talked about that, 40 parameters, and they get delimited with specify the out file name. By default, it creates one called mono standard out. That's your entire console output that gets output there, so you can use it. Gets auto cleared every time you call a program, so you want to make sure that if you were to call a .NET program and it completes, that you consume that data and do something with it before you make another call. And then we talked about the default path, right? So you're going to use opt mono bind. And then standard out. So for those of you that don't know what standard output is, again, it's console output from a PACE or a QShell app or a Python app or whatever, similar to IBM job log, allows us to pass the data back and lets us consume it. So to me, I found it to be kind of the easiest and the best way to communicate between apps. I don't know if you guys recommend that usually from the IBM side. I mean, it adds overhead in some cases, right? But that assumes if you've got a web service or a web server that's running, you probably wouldn't be piping data back that way. You'd return data as JSON or XML or something like that. But it's good for CL command style stuff. So display standard out. So the only time you'd want to display the standard out is if you're in debugging and testing, right? Because you want to see what's going on in that thing. So every time I run my program, it's going to send me back. It's going to pop up and it'll display the out file so I can see it. So to me, I found that hugely useful when I'm debugging what's wrong with my programs, and then I'm outputting to the console. So normally that would be no in production. Yep, so no for production. Logging, so this would be job log. So I created a CPF message file. So it puts out a net 9898 if you decide to pump these into the job log. But like I said, I was doing a directory crawl of QOpenSys, and I happened to leave the job logging on. So I blew out my job log. Oh, that should have wrapped. I don't know why my job blew up on that one, but because, maybe I don't think I had wrap set on the thing. But so you can pipe that to the job log. So if you have an app like, I don't know, any of the health systems apps or anything that monitors job log information, you can pump information back into the job log and use it. So I thought that was kind of a cool use case. And then print again if you want to print those job logs out. And then, of course, delete by default. That's on, right? So it's going to clean up the IFS file that it creates. Always want to delete it. And everything else gets synthesized and pulled out for the job log, the out file before it cleans up. But I default to cleaning that up. So temp mono should almost always stay empty. But we have that clear command just in case it does. Mono 2, like we said, so you'll notice here it's one single quote to limited parameter, and then in the C# command line, Java works this way too, is your parameters just have double quotes around it. And those can be variables or whatever if you're passing it from a CL program. But I usually pass that as one big argument. I just tend to use the plain old mono command. And you'll see how we wrap that into another CL as well. Talked about you can choose either one. Mono path sets up the mono path like we talked about. So I would recommend using this guy before you use any calls, or if you know how the right way to set defaults, which I don't yet. You could set them in your job or in your system. Is there a spot where they would set like default other than a system value? I'm thinking for like if I wanted Optimano or my package directories always available right away, where would I set that to? Okay, so it's in the home directory. Okay. Yeah, this is actually going through QShell, and then it calls because it needs the threading, because otherwise it blows chunks. Yeah, yeah, and that's what that mono path command does. It just sets it locally. I didn't want to really mess with system level because you don't know what people are doing at system level. So I thought, sounds like user level, whether it's in the home directory or whether you set it in your job through environment variables. Okay, all right, so we're on the right path already. But that's what this does, is sets those environment variables for you. And you can modify it because you'll have the source. And then the DB2 version, like I said, sets some paths that I would use if I was doing DB2 Connect. And I'll still document that. I haven't released any documentation on it yet, but I got it to work, believe it or not, with Calvin's help. Thank you, Calvin. Made those AIX binaries get ignored that I didn't really need, and we actually got it to work. And then other ways we just talked about, Jesse shared with us. That's cool. Mono IFS check, so you can check for a file exists or not exists. So you can use that as a convenience command if you want to. The temp clear command, mono query temp, we talked about that. And then mono xbuild. So you can use that if you want to compile. Although because of the NuGet issue, I still think Visual Studio is how I would do things. All right, so now you got infrastructure up and running. So the next step would be now we want to install the Git sample. So this URL takes and actually generates, I put it off the root system. It creates a directory called /. So the idea here is you go into QP term and do a cd/, and then run this command, and then it'll actually create a /mono sample or mono on samples subdirectory, right? So you see that top level directory. So just to show you on this guy. So here we have this, and then it pulls all the projects in too. It's kind of nice. So as I add projects to that GitHub site, you can do is it pull? If I want to refresh new projects, just do a pull on it. Yeah. So as we add new projects or people contribute to the samples here, we'll have a new sample set, and you can just pull the latest and greatest versions there. More than likely, you might do a pull to your Windows machine if you're doing Visual Studio like I am, and that's how I'm building all my examples typically. But GitHub is cool, or Git is cool because you can pull right into the IFS. All right. So let's look at. We'll try xbuild just so we can see how that works, just to prove that does work. If I were building locally, I would just go into that directory in my paste thing, and I'd say xbuild. This is why I always already forgot syntax in it. /p /cs2.
Yeah, the reason why you have to specify that is because by default it'll use the Microsoft It'll work everywhere except the big Indian platforms, which tries to hate this. We're working on fixing that though, so.
Oh, whoops! I didn't do my. term. Come on, hello world. All right. CSC tool. exe. Now you know why I dislike this command, and I typed it wrong. I do xbuild. So in this case, it actually it took from that .NET solution, and so it's building based on that, right? So and now it built our program for us. And then if we were to go gotta go deeper in here. So .NET compiler will build this for us. So this is actually executable. Did I get this wrong? I did? Mono, hello, oh, Word. Hello, Word. My Microsoft Word background. All right. And then, so if I were running from the command line, we'll just run this. See? It takes me so literally, it should just find these things. There we go. All right. So one of the techniques, and I'll show this in the C# code, is I tend to do this. I do this on CL programs too. You'll see I check the params that are needed at the front, and I'll kind of show you that. But so you'll see this says I have 3 required parameters. It blew up with a error code 99, which I induced. So in this case, we'll put all the correct parameters. Parm1 doesn't really need to be anything special other than parm1. And so this is if I'm calling parm2 and parm. And then we'll do this. Now you're going to see it blew up again because parm3 is supposed to be a Boolean, right? So you want to put as much checking at the front end if you're doing parameter typing, but it just needs a true flag. And then it comes out and it dumps all that information. And so some of the C code, Calvin was talking about how it finds system paths. So in this Hello World program, I listed a bunch of those things like the assembly full path, right? So, and like he was talking about, it converts it to IFS format, so it finds all that stuff. And so if you had a settings file that was in that relative directory or something like that, if you wanted to know the program name that was running or the current directory or the system name or the username, a lot of that stuff. System directory doesn't show up ironically enough because I don't know what would be considered system directory for .NET, right? Yeah. Yeah, so no, I just found that interesting because I was thinking, yeah, what is my Win System 32 directory, right? Don't know. All right, so that seemed to work. Xbuild works. We're cool on that. So I think we've already done this test, so we're good there. Ran it. Don't need that. And again, just definition of standard out. I had this extra slide that I forgot to move it. But console output, program output, that's all of your standard out, standard error. I was going to ask you guys, where does standard? I never use standard error. It's everything. I always dump everything to standard out. Is that actually used in a? I mean, where do you guys typically see that? It would be cool. I don't know if we can use it currently with .NET though, right? Oh, okay, there you go. So I'll update my samples to use that because I just hadn't had a chance to play with that. But that would separate good messages from bad messages, right? So that's good to know. So we. That's perfect. I hadn't even thought. I've always used console.writeline, but the fact that I can use console.error is now I know, so I can fix some of those up. See, I know I learned one new thing today. That's cool. All right. So integrating, we talked about the mono commands, right? So allows our .NET commands to be embedded, pass parameters, receive, return, pipeline, all that stuff we talked about, standard out. So I always like to do sort of a visual flow so people kind of think of how this works. So typically the idea would be that if you're going to call a .NET app, you're going to use the mono CL command or maybe a wrapper before that, which you'll see an example. Then it's going to call the .NET component. It does start Q shell, starts that, which then starts a paste process, and then the .NET program runs to completion, and then creates the out file in IFS for you. And if it succeeds, we send back a 0 or a non-zero value, kind of like your CPF 0000. Well, actually, I don't think you'd ever send that, but like CPF, I tend to hang on CPF 9898 if there's errors, or an escape message, right? Same concept. If it's a non-zero, it's bad. If it's 0, it's good. And then when we're all done, paste completes, Q shell completes, and then we're back in our standard IBMI job stream. So we've gotten that standard out information into the IFS, and RCL command then takes it and puts it into the out file. So all this is transparent. The beauty is you don't have to think about it. And then it'll send an escape message by default if we got a non-zero return code. And then the idea is it returns control to your original CL or RPG program. So most of the time, I'd say if you're consuming data, it's going to be maybe I output to a database file when I ran this. Maybe I output to an IFS file that I want to use for my RPG, or maybe I just want to read this out file, which I've done too, where I just need to, like when I was doing I did some git wrapper commands where I was reading the git results, and I wanted to do something based on what I found that. But it was the idea of making git consumable for an RPG programmer as well. And then there's our original app that's using it. So hopefully that makes sense. But I always like to do one visual of how that whole process works, because there's actually a lot. If you think about it, there's a lot of things going on in there. But as long as you use the mono wrapper command, it's all automatic. And Calvin brought us .NET. That's the other part, right? And so, all right. So let's go actually try this guy out. And a lot of times, if you're building on Windows, you probably wouldn't have a path this long either. I just chose this because I wanted to use the same build path that .NET was using. But you really maybe just have a top-level directory. You put your executable apps in, and then you put all the DLLs in there at the same time. Hello world. Oh, it's mono hello world, right? But this will just show you that same thing we just did, and then mono world. And then we'll just put in arm1. We don't need double quotes because that happens automatically in this guy. Arm2. And you'll see this is the standard parameter list type of stuff we do, right? Oh, and you got to do if you need more than 2. Here's our 3 parms. And then it's going to create our out file. And then since we're testing, let's say display. I did it again, didn't I? Maybe it's the O key on my keyboard. I'll blame it on the keyboard. That's right. Mono, mono, mono. Mono on. Are we closer? No. Mono, hello. Yeah, you need that. We got the exe. Mono, hello world. Mono, hello world. Oh, never mind. This is why we don't like long paths. Fine. Debug. So that's the path to that executable because of how we built it. And the Visual Studio does that same exact pathing. That's why it's nice to have a much shorter directory path for these things. Yeah. So then you'll see all that data that came back out on the console comes here, right? So there's all that data that we were piping back. Even I always output the exit code too, just in case I want to use it in the log. You know, maybe that's just me, but and then so it came back normally, right? So that's cool. And then so let's put a bad parm for this guy again, something that's non-Boolean. And you'll see now it failed, and it came back with our error. But it's all pipelined. I don't have to use QP2 term. I had issues when I was calling QP2 shell because of threading. So that's why I ended up stepping around through Q shell to make that work. I don't understand all that, but I know it works. So definitely something we should talk about. Because I'd rather call QP2 shell on those if I could. But so that shows it's there. So now let's just show. We'll turn all these guys on just so you can. We'll do it all at once. Display, log, print, delete. Give it all. Give it to me all. So that failed. But if I do my display job log, so you can see all that's available in there. Every one of those lines has a net 9898 on it. So I think you could probably even do mon message on those if there was a reason to, and you were to send escape messages. But I just send them back technically as informational in the log. And then if we do, probably not in this job, it is in this job. There's the same log of the spool file, right? So pretty easy to use any of that stuff. All wrapped up nicely with bow. All right. Did that, did that, did that, go that, did that. I was gearing this towards if I didn't have a demo environment, because in the future, someday I may not. And we talked about mono paths. So if you're going to use it with hello world, we did our example there already. Showed the output. That's your console output. That's the completed normally. And there's our CPF 9898. And then here was calling it with parms, writing to the job log. There's the job log we looked at. Okay. And the spool file. We already saw them. But they're there for posterity, so you can watch the video, read the slide. So kind of the summary on those guys, mass complexity of mono.NET calls. That was a regular job to consume those. You can create and consume standard out and allows your CL and RPG to easily integrate. And it's open source, so you can do your own variations. So let's look at a couple samples since we have a little bit of time left. So like I was talking about, probably what you would do if you're building these is you would check them out through GitHub on your PC. I tend to use SourceTree. There's a bunch of Git clients. You can just use the Git command line to do it. But the general build process there would be open in Visual Studio. So I've got this, if I was doing Hello World in that scenario. So it's already, this project's already open in there. It's a console application. There's our time zone component, right? So I got some to-dos in there that we still got to figure that out. There's all the information that we were looking at. then we validate our parameters here, right? I have an expected parameters. If that fails, it throws an error with that message. That's where we saw that message. It said it needed those parameters. If not, it runs and does its thing. So top down, and try catch is much like your mon message, right? So in a CL, you'd have a mon message, and then I use finally to do all my cleanup and shutdown. So the general pattern, this hello world one is a good one, and I think I'll publish just a bare pattern one too, right, with no code in it, because I think it'll be useful just as I need a boilerplate. But this mono hello world one is a good one to start with if you're doing just a brand new app and gives you some structure. All right, so let's look at the time zone one. So we talked about. So I'll show you the code that this is doing. So built into the sample. There we go. This time zone. So you'll see this one sets up the environment, but then I can actually just loop through. So this whole program is just looping through and outputting to my log. So if you think about it, if you've got some stuff that's just doing real simple things and you want to output back to your RPG app, that's technically, if you look at all the build-up stuff, that's extra. There's 4 lines that are actually doing something here, and it's doing a data dump of all my time zones for me, right? So I thought that would be useful for you guys to be able to do. So we'll do that one. So you can see it work. Oh, and actually, I think I already preset some of these, so we didn't have to. Or maybe we didn't. Oh, there we go. Actually, we'll do it this way. Since we're running low on time today. All right, we'll just copy and paste that guy. So this is using our mono command. It's got to fix up because sometimes when you copy and paste from the green screen, it messes it up. That never happens, does it? And so in this case, no parameters. We're just calling the executable. We're outputting it, and we'll display it so you can see what it gives us. So in this particular example, you can see there's a ton of different time zones that are packed in there. That's just your American one. So anyways, if time zone is an issue, you can run this example, and I thought that was just a nice, useful utility showing how to list some system properties that you can take advantage of. So the next one on our list we'll look at. So this one actually is, this one I thought was the coolest use case, and Jesse, to your point on use cases, is I know there's a lot of apps, like I know we have Robot Space. There's apps out there that need to crawl the IFS, right? And I've never seen anybody do a good one until this one, taking credit for that. But I found that when I was using the directory crawling stuff, Microsoft has put together some stuff that I wasn't sure. First time I tried it, I was crawling. I took one of their samples that crawls, and because of symbolic links, it kept crawling and crawling and crawling and crawling the same stuff, right? Because it wasn't recognizing the symbolic links. And then I found what was the flag, Calvin? I forget. I'd have to look at my source. Yeah, it has to find the junction points, which basically are symbolic links, right? So once I put that check in there, I actually crawled the Q OpenSys. I think it was on this Academy system in about 5 minutes. It was about 100,000 files, but it got me everything, including all the paths, all the sizes, which is what we're looking for usually, right? I used to be the disk police when I ran my company. But so all that information. And so this example not only pulls it into an IFS file, but it dumps it into a database. Now you can use SQL or whatever you want to actually look at that code on that. So what I did is I thought, rather than using the mono command, let's build a convenience command, right? So if I'm a developer on the I, rather than typing mono for everything I do, let me build a wrapper over the wrapper, which is very thin layer, right? So now I have real parameters. Give me the IFS directory I want to list. Give me the file filter I want to list. Give me the include subdirectories. Give me the IFS location. I had to put a sleep throttle on it because it literally floors the CPU. It's that fast that it floors the CPU. So you can put, if you're running this in the daytime, maybe put a couple second delay. So every 1,000 files or so, it sleeps a couple seconds or whatever you want for the delay. But I was amazed at how fast it ran, and it'll take as much CPU as it can get. I don't know if that's a paste byproduct or a .NET byproduct or whatever, but so I thought, good example of showing how to throttle an application, right? So we'll leave it at 0, and we're just crawling my directory, so it won't kill this machine. But try this sample on your machines and try just crawling QOpenSys. Very cool to be able to find big stuff. So you'll see we logged some stuff. We're using, I borrowed, Kevin, you had a DB2 sample that I borrowed, I think, when I wrote my pace wrapper class. I was having a hard time using the CLI until I found that. Thank you for that. So I try and drop the table, make sure it's gone, my temp table. I create the table in there, and then it crawls the directory. And then at the end, since I'm actually, I created a delimited file in the IFS on the way, I just thought, just to illustrate how you can use the CL command, we do a copy from stream file into our SQL table when we're done. And then it clears everything up. And so even a summary here, right? So 1,098 files that crawled in pretty quick, 286 directories, 0 symbolic links, so it tracks that too, and then the bytes. And then each individual file will have that too. So then if I want to look at it through Start SQL, I can just look at this now, right? And so I was nice enough to break it down by directory or file. I don't catch object types, although this does crawl QSys lab directories as well. Members show up as files. I don't know, how does that work? Yeah, a source file shows up as a directory actually, and then the members show up as a file, which I thought was cool. But the file, directory name, just the directory name, just the file name. I think I did just the extension too, in case you wanted to do some SQL around it after you were done. And then the size, the create time, last write time, create time ISO, in case you want to do ISO, last write ISO, all that sort of stuff. So I thought that was a useful utility for directory crawling, and I've never used anything faster than this. So kudos to whatever Calvin did to make it run fast. Yeah, well, I was amazed. It just smokes, and so I was impressed. One thing I did note, and you always in .NET you can choose to build x86, x64. I think I just left it at all, but it needs the 64-bit version, so whatever flag you need for that, because it's running 64-bit when it runs. All right, cool. So time zones we got our directory list. Oh, so how this wrapper was built, right? Just to show you how simple it was. Oh, actually, we should showcase RDI today, right? So we have, so I just created a new CL command, right? So it has all those parameters on it. And I borrowed from the mono one, but internally, so other than the parm definitions, what do you think it's doing? It's calling mono. so that's all that this guy does. It's a convenience wrapper, cosmetic, whatever you want to call it. It just makes it easy to consume by a CL or an RPG person who doesn't care anything about .NET. They just want to run this, right? Cool. And so yeah, so I did. I think it was about 5 minutes. I was able to crawl QOpenSys on my machine, which I thought was nice. And it's smart enough not to follow those symbolic link chains. Because I think I put when I was testing, it was on the weekend, fortunately, but the machine was just churning and churning for about an hour, and I thought, chances are it's in a loop, and it was. All right, so somebody actually was looking for this on mid-range lists. So I thought, oh, I'll write a sample for this. They just wanted to convert an XML file to CSV, right? Usually there should be things to do that, but so in this case, we're going to synthesize the XML file and read it, and then write it out to a CSV document, right? So we'll use our mono XML to CSV. And I actually did a version, I don't have it in this mix yet, but it'll be in the repository. I did one that'll just take a straight up text, like if you have an ASCII text file or anything in a TXT format with page breaks, it'll suck it in and turn it into a PDF. So I just want to publish some ASCII data. That's kind of cool. I have all kinds of places where I plan on using these utilities. All right. Damn path. Why did it do that to me? 2 XML. Yeah, it does it to even these. That's why I tested them earlier, but they got lost somewhere in the buffer. All right. So in this case, I went back to the mono command, but if I have a delimiter that I wanted to use, so I use pipe. I like the pipe delimiter because then commas and stuff that I need, like double quotes, stay in place. So I tend to use the pipe delimiters. That's a replace, I think, flag. And then you'll see XML input file, CSV output file, right? So I think that was it. So this just blasted through. This is only 12 records, but it's using the JSON. I think this one uses JSON.net, but built-in XML handler in .NET. And then, oh no, we're not going to JSON. But then I think I found a CSV handler class that I use for this. So pretty fast. Even on, I did about a 50,000 record file, maybe took 20 seconds, something like that. So I mean, you know, again, those utilities that we keep running across, and I know a lot of them can be done in Python, PHP, and Ruby. You know, it's sort of like a pick your flavor, right? Yeah, no, yeah, surprisingly, but I found that with Python though too, right? It smokes when you kick off a job. So I think it's something that's not Java. I guess would be the scenario because yeah, PHP, anything that's calling into pace, I think tends to go. That's where Calvin gives the cool technical definition, and I give the, I love it, it's fast. Kidding. But as you can see, so here was our original file, so our XML, right? So that's what I borrowed one of the Microsoft book examples, and then we synthesized it into this guy. So we got our column headings and our data and that sort of stuff. So now I could actually use copy from stream file or what is it, copy to import file, copy from import file, if I wanted to do that too. And don't use that command. Painful to support. Yeah, exactly. So I tend not to do that, but I wanted to show it just more as a use case of how you can use it if you needed to. All right, XML, got a couple more. This one is probably the coolest one I found, MailKit. Calvin helped me last week. We were having a discussion on how do I get these certs to work, because we were talking earlier about you have to import the certs and all that sort of stuff. So there's a whole sequence that you have to go through. When I was bummed when I was talking to Calvin, I'm like, oh man, I'm not going to be able to show this example. It's not going to work. And then once you explain how to pull the certs, and then I went and got there's an Office 365 cert because we were actually using it with, in my case, my Office 365 account. Yeah, they're called the default roots, I think. And then I'll have that in my, yeah, I have that in my code write up. So there's a couple command lines, and I'll actually add a slide here, but shows you how the first time, actually, in fact, it should be almost the thing you do right when you load the mono environment. Just load the certs and make sure you're good to go. Trust no one but me. So you'll see, so I wrote a wrapper here again, right, to make it consumable. You know, I needed a cool send mail command on the ISL, and I know I've written one, Health Systems has written one. You know, we've all probably got some version of, it might be a send distribution we used to use. But this is a good way to exercise that subject body file, so you can include a disclaimer if you want. Attachment, one or more attachments, just put a semicolon after them. And then here we're going to Office 365. There's their SMTP server. Our authentication could be none, or I use auto, which is nice. And are we using authentication? Yes. And then my user. And of course, we make our password invisible, right? We don't want anybody to know my password. So fortunately, CL lets us do that. If I got it right, we'll get an email. All right, email sent successfully. And if we do it wrong, send it without the password. You could. You'd want password retrieval safe on the I, or I mean, typically, especially if Robin Tatum was here, he'd be telling us, no, don't store passwords. So you have to store it somewhere and pass it somehow, right? So. Oh, sure. Yeah, you know, in fact, that would be a cool use case because Secret Server has a REST API, so you could actually log into Secret Server, but then you got to pass your Secret Server credentials, retrieve the password, and then pass it to this. That's a perfect use case. Yeah, because I've Yeah, in this case, you'd have to probably put it into, because from my understanding, you can check out a copy of a credential or log in and say, I want to use it, and it will bring the value back. And then you can plug it here if you wanted to, if that makes sense. So it's like I'm going to the library checking out my password, and I can throw it into here. Or the C# program would probably be where you'd do it, right? If it's smart enough, you'd have an extra, maybe my secret server credential or whatever, and then you could set it and actually put it in your home directory, but then it's now you got stuff unencrypted sitting in the file system. Yeah, so not answerable here, but secret server would work really cool. That's actually a good use case. You got me thinking now. I'd have to load secret server. Yeah, I know we just did a acquisition on a security company. I was asking them. I thought we had an option for that. We currently don't have one, but there's a couple other ones. There's CyberArk, right? Psychotic. There's one called Auth0. I forget, but there's a couple of those. So you'll see it failed this time, right? Because my password didn't go. It did what it was supposed to. Thank you. And again, that was just I wrote a sendmail command that made it consumable around the mono command. Definitely cool. All right, we're in the home stretch. All right, this is where, Kevin, I use DB2 CLI. All right, so I wrote because I was having so many issues with database, I thought, ooh, DB2 CLI, will that work for me? So I had to play around with it a little bit and figure out what I wanted to do with it. And I thought, well, as a stopgap, well, let's do this. We'll have something we can use to play around with if all else fails. All right, I think we're all lined up. So in this case, it's the first example that I wrote, so it's called mono run paste. And so you can actually run with this guy, so system command, which is like CL commands, right? It'll actually bring back CPF messages for you. DB2 CLI, which is like a command line SQL query. And I think you can do inserts and updates too, right? I've just been doing selects, but theoretically you can, yeah. And then you can run QShell or paste commands as well, which is cool. It runs, compiles anywhere, probably only runs on I because you're not going to have the DB2 CLI and some of those off of I. And it uses what's called system diagnostics process.start, which says spawn a new process to run that paste job. So in this case, so you'll see what it gave me. I don't know that I'd always put this out, but I wanted to just for illustration purposes. You'll see it ran our query. So this is what it actually ran, DB2, and then it has the query that's escaped. I think that's where you had the syntax on a post somewhere that I found it. But because you can't get the field metadata that I know of, I found that the dashes actually delimit the field width, right? So I ended up doing a thing that finds the dash line, it parses the field width, and then it breaks them out. So, probably not an ideal way to do it, but it works. It wasn't too bad. And then I look for, the selected value, so I know I'm at end of file, right? So if you probably wouldn't want to do 1 million or 2 million records this way querying. It works for small record sets, and I just wanted to do it because I knew I could make it work, and so I thought it was a good example of just using some of the straight up paste stuff. And then you have I'm getting delays. That must be the Wi-Fi. Only one off on that one. So this one's just going to do a send message, right? Just to show you we can do a CL command. In this case, that send message, it's a system command. That was kind of like our action parameter in this example. So you can see it just ran it, sent it just fine to Richard, no errors, so it came back 0. That's good. If we blow it up, now you get to action nice CPF messages. So you can actually call this, run something, consume the CPF messages just like you would in a CL, and then deal with it if there's a problem. And then you'll also notice it failed, right? So it came back. This actually blew up. So if I had this in a CL or an RPG, I'd have to do a mon message or a I forget what it is in RPG. All right, last example. This is where I actually I thought, all right, what can I do that ties into one of our production products here at Help System? So we have a product. Oh, so there's a DLL example too that takes us into a class library. So that's out on the site. That's if you wanted to, and I'll package that on NuGet at some point so you can just consume it. So the check-in command. So this is actually, so WebDocs is our document management software. Actually, somebody, when I wrote this, somebody had come to me and they said, hey, we have a customer that's migrating from our IBMI to our Windows version of the software. How can I just reach out and check in a document from the IFS? I don't know. So I was like, well, we got a web service now, right? So I just wrote a little CL program, or not CL program, but a C# program that took in all the parameters that WebDocs needs for the web service, takes the IFS file, posts it, sends all the metadata across, all JSON. So I wrapped it into a CL command. So in this case, it gives me a seamless check-in command where I can just, in a couple seconds, using our web service, I can actually check in. And this is just calling mono under the covers again, right? So it's the mono command, and then the actual corresponding executable. And end of day. All right, so you have all those parameters. Again, we don't want people to know our password, right? So we make sure that doesn't get logged. So then in this case, so these are the GUIDs for a document type. What folder do I want to go to? Here's the IFS file, and I want to just run this. So and that's the executable. So just posted that over my Windows server and checked it into my WebDocs repository. That's huge from a consumability standpoint because our services team does lots of integration sort of things, and being able to have native things like this at your beck and call and saying, I don't have to write this stuff in RPG, or maybe I don't know Python or Java or whatever. I know we use Java heavily here, but having another tool in your arsenal to be able to do this stuff with is huge. And a lot of times, like in this case, I had a sample that I repurposed I had already done in Windows. I just took the code over, compiled it, and I wrapped the mono command around it, and it just worked. So to me, that's the power of being able to use this stuff on I. And I can't thank Calvin enough for wanting to get involved in this project, because I think that's given us all sort of a place to hang our hats in terms of having .NET running natively on I. All right, so by wrappers, we already talked about that, right? All the things that are good about making this consumable from our IBMI stuff. Database layers at work, DB2 CLI, example we just showed. I did an XML service wrapper about 2 years ago, I think, maybe. And then actually it's 3 years ago, 2000, maybe more, maybe 2013 I wrote that. Then when .NET Core came out within that window, I actually turned it into what's called a .NET Standard Library, which means it actually runs on Linux, because .NET Core runs on Linux, the same exact code. The same exact code can be lifted and dropped into the IFS and run too. So this API works. The ADO.NET driver, Calvin took the version that was shipped with Mono, and I think we were talking about the wide and narrow pointers, so he's done some working with that. I've gotten the data stuff. It's been a while. I have to go revisit it. Had some issues getting it to work. Stored procedures were causing a problem, so we'll revisit that at some time. Liam Allen did a project called Illusion, whatever, but that's kind of a JSON-based replacement for XML service, so you can send and receive JSON. And it works really well, pretty fast. We were just talking about it a little while ago. Right now, he's not working on that project. DB2 Connect I tried. And then I think our IBMI friends have something going on too that I've also tested a little bit too. Can I mention it, or do you want to mention it? Yeah, so Jesse was kind enough he was asking me about what I knew about Unix ODBC, and I said, a little, why? And he said, well, it just so happens that we're working on porting the client access ODBC driver over to work on IBMI or in PACE. Probably AIX it would work too, wouldn't it, technically, or maybe not? Okay, we won't commit to that. But it already worked on Linux, because there's a Linux version that comes out with ACS, right? So you can install it there, and then Windows. So literally, like the CWB ping. So the first version I installed was from last July, and then I couldn't get it to work, and then I was like, well, it's not working. And Jesse finally, a couple days later, said, well, try this one. And sure enough, I put it on there. So whatever happened between last July and what was current, it was working. And we actually got it to work. The only problem was I could read data, but I can't get any of the field names. It gives me ordinal positions, so I have to somehow get the field list ahead of time or be specific on the SQL I'm doing and know the field. So I'm thinking, I don't think it's that ODBC layer. I think it's something in Mono. But so Calvin and I will probably look at that and see if we can figure that out. But so that's why I classify all the 4 bottom things as experimental. The top 2 things will work pretty well. And you know, again, I've only been doing this a few months as a side project outside of work. Calvin, a year, a little over a year. And so we're hoping this will move forward and just get better with time. But there's a lot of production stuff that you can do now. So I think that's pretty cool. All right. Thank you. Appreciate your time. And hopefully you guys try this out.